passionate speech. Now I invite Ms. Madhvi Diwan to give her opinion. All over to you, ma'am.
Still barely morning, so good morning. And thank you for inviting me, and thank you for those very, very kind and generous words, many of which I don't deserve. You know, the last time I was invited here, actually by the foundation, I think it was at the Constitutional Club, and it was about 7 months ago. It was an exciting time, as it is even today. Because this was around the third week of, or the fourth week of May, when the Supreme Court had just concluded hearing in the Triple Talaq case. They had reserved judgment. And, you know, we were sort of curious as to what was going to happen. And of course, we had to wait 3 months, and on 22nd August, they delivered a very historic judgment. It was a 3:2 majority, and of course, I think you broadly know what they said. The majority said, 2 of the judges, 2 out of 3 said that it is a practice which is, talaq-e-bidat is manifestly arbitrary and whimsical, and because it, you know, it allows a man to whimsically and in an instant divorce his wife, and therefore it is manifestly arbitrary and struck down. And the third judge, Justice Kurian, he said that since it is universally acknowledged that it is a sinful practice, what is bad in theology must be bad in law. And this is actually something which was quoted in the Time magazine subsequently, that Justice Kurian has said what is bad in theology must be bad in law, and therefore he struck down the practice of triple talaq. But I have to say that it was a chastening experience even for me personally, because I had not dealt with, I assisted on the side of the government of India, and it was an exciting time. But I have to say that when initially the Supreme But the court decided to just limit the issue to that one narrow point, which is talaq-e-bidat, and they proceeded with the hearing. And you know, when I thought to myself, I thought this makes it much easier, the task much easier, and I was reasonably confident in my mind that I think the petitioners would succeed on this. But I did realize that although, you know, they did succeed, but it was, you know, it could have been a unanimous judgment, and I did realize how hard it is to bell the cat on reform, and really a lot of admiration for activists like Ms. Soman, who have really put themselves out there very fearlessly and bravely. But it is very, very difficult to bell the cat on reform and to change the status quo. We are 70 years after independence, and you had, I mean, I saw with some astonishment in the Supreme Court how certain organizations, including the All India Muslim Personal Law Board, how they argued with such vigor and vehemence that, you know, this is part of our personal law. It is, you know, they elevated it, of course, to a status of a fundamental right. You know, personal law was elevated to the status of an impregnable fortress where no matter how egregious it may be to fundamental rights, nobody can enter. Nobody can enter that until you have a legislation. Nobody's got any business to interfere, and therefore the courts should stay their hands. That was the thrust of their argument. And even though religion, you know, by our courts has been defined under Article 25, what is protected is really the core of the religion and the religious practices. Marriage, divorce, inheritance, adoption, things like that are really not regarded as part of Article 25 itself. And yet, with such vehemence, they sought to protect themselves effectively against reform. So that was really quite an eye-opener, and then eventually we got the 3:2 judgment. It was not unanimous, but yet the minority also, what they said is that I think it was unanimous on their condemnation of triple talaq, but what they did say is that in our wisdom we feel it's best for the legislature to act on this, and they directed them to do so in a time-bound manner. And of course, you know, they mentioned international practices, and they felt that the court should, that in India also we should come up to speed with the rest of the world, and also with the rest of the Muslim world, which has undergone some reform. Now, you know, there is now, of course, a bill which has generated some excitement and a lot of debate both inside and outside Parliament, and I thought it would be interesting to just have a debate on that and, you know, question some of the issues. Because, you know, one thing we need to bear in mind is that, unfortunately, the All India Muslim, the Law Board, and other organizations, this has always been projected as a religious minority issue. And I think that, you know, it's necessary to highlight this as an issue which concerns a very big minority within a minority. And every minority is not a religious minority. We have gender minorities. And the largest minority in our country is women. Why do we not look at women as a minority? And surely gender should at some stage trump religion. So therefore, I think in the guise of religion and protecting the fundamental right under Article 25 beyond a point, how long can we keep pushing gender rights under the carpet? I mean, that is one important issue, because I think we need to remember that when you empower a man, you empower the man. When you empower a woman, you empower her and you empower her family. So it goes a long way into determining the future of that family and the future of the community at large. So when you have the rest of, you know, the challenge for the Muslim community in India is that, you know, being a minority, but it's a very large minority, and in actual numbers we're talking about a lot of people. The challenge is that they are coexisting with other people who have full rights to the constitution, full entitlements, a full right to assert constitutional values, fundamental rights. But Muslim women do not. So religion is made a pretext to deny the full enjoyment of fundamental rights. And when we talk of the bill, I mean, I think it'll be just interesting to sort of a little back and forth. I'm sure Ms. Soman will have different ideas on this also. But I was just debating in my mind, because you broadly know what the bill says. It makes the triple talaq a punishable offense, for up to 3 years. And it provides, I mean, maintenance for the wife, and custody of her children. So broadly this is it, and it's a spare kind of bill. It doesn't say too much, but at the same time it says a lot. And the issues that have arisen is, one, should this be penalized? Should it be made a criminal offense? One, is it contrary to the Sharia? Because marriage under Muslim law is treated as a civil contract, so can you criminalize something like triple talaq? And they say that the divorce becomes invalid anyway, because the Supreme Court has said so. So it's invalid anyway, so why are we penalizing the man? Why are we putting him in jail? And how will he provide maintenance for his wife and children if he's going to be in jail? These are broadly the issues which have been raised. Now, you know, the point here is, one, why should we criminalize? Because I would say that this is a practice, as you know, vigorously and vehemently asserted by the Muslim Personal Law Board, and not just them, there were other organizations who also very aggressively asserted that this is a practice which has been in vogue for 1400 years. We may regard it as sinful, wrong, whatever else, but it is still a valid practice. According to them, it was good in theology. And good in law. It led to the end of a marriage, which became completely irrevocable. So now the point is, when you have such strong organizations which have held sway, assert with such confidence that this is a practice which is in vogue. It has been in vogue for 1400 years. And no matter how much it destroys the life of a woman, we have the right to assert it. So does society, whether by a criminal offense or some other method, should society not send out a very strong message that such practices will not be countenanced at all? There will be zero tolerance for this. And how do you, one aspect is of course how, now that the Supreme Court has held that it is invalid, how do you assert it? How does a woman effectively implement this? Because if her husband says talaq, 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 he says that look, the marriage is over, and she says that no, I'm sorry, under law today it is invalid. The Supreme Court has said so, and he says, so what if the Supreme Court has said so? And under the talaq as it stands even today, the point is you do not have to go to any authority or court of law. A man, it is still unilateral. It is still unilateral because you do not have to go to a court of law, whereas when a woman, a Muslim woman, if she wants divorce and the husband doesn't agree to it, she may need to go to a court of law and get a judicial decree where she has to prove. This is under a 1939 legislation. She needs to prove that he is at fault or he is, inflicted her with cruelty or whatever it is, and therefore she is entitled to divorce. But it is quite unequal. So therefore, when he does not need to go to any court of law to get a divorce, in that sense it is unilateral. Where does she assert herself and say that, look, he is issued triple talaq, where do I go now? So you need some enforcement mechanism. And perhaps the bill makes an attempt at that. Now, whether that will be, a practical method, not practical, how it will work out, we do not know. Whether it will go through at all, we do not know at this stage. But you need an enforcement mechanism. That is one. Second point is that, when you need to send out a strong signal that we do not countenance a practice like this. Because, for example, now, one of the issues has been raised that why are you making such a big deal out of it? How many cases of triple talaq do we have? Now, in practice, it would seem, and Ms. Soman would certainly have a much better information on this, but when we were studying some of the papers, NCW report was there, and these people had traveled the length and breadth of the country and documented cases where women complained bitterly about not just triple talaq, but polygamy of nikah halala and so on. That is one aspect. Two is, you see, even when, for example, sati was outlawed, or bigamy, for example. Now, it was not as if every single Hindu widow was putting herself was being pushed into the funeral pyre with her husband. It wasn't like that. Not that every Christian man or Hindu man was indulging in bigamy or polygamy. But the point was that even though whether numbers were big or small, society had to send in a message of zero tolerance. And therefore, these were made penal. There was legislation on this. Bigamy, for example, was made a penal offense. So therefore, to say that numbers should affect actual numbers is a bit of a myth. Number two, I think more important than actual numbers of triple talaq is the fact that whether or not triple talaq is practiced, the point is that it's intrinsically entwined with the social status of a woman. Because she knows at the end of the day, this is a sword that dangles over her head, consciously or subconsciously. She knows she cannot assert herself within the marriage, in the sense that the lines are drawn for her, the Lakshman Rekhas are such, that she knows if she goes beyond a certain point, she asserts herself, she knows the possible consequences. One, it also determines her choices outside the marriage, how much to be educated, whether to have a career or to seek any other method of fulfillment. She needs to keep her husband happy at the end of the day at all given times and pander to his ego because she knows the consequences. So whether or not that triple talaq is actually pronounced or not pronounced, it is irrelevant. It is the social status of a woman that it determines. And that is why practices like this need to be banished, and banished from a man's mind, because he should not even think that this is a possibility or a prospect that I can turn my wife out of the house, break the marital tie in an instant at my own whim and caprice. And how does society send out that message is, in my view, it should be a penal offense. That is my view. I mean, I'm sure that many people will disagree with me, but I feel it should be. Now, for example, in the case of bigamy as well, under the IPC, it is made punishable with, I think, up to 7 years imprisonment. Now, there too, it would be argued that, look, the second marriage in any case is invalid in the eyes of law. Like in triple talaq, they are saying that triple talaq itself is invalid, it doesn't break, they are still man and wife. But in the case of bigamy, the second marriage is invalid in the eyes of law. The man is still required to maintain his first wife and the children from that marriage. But at the same time, the law penalizes it because it regards the act of bigamy as something so egregious to the dignity of the other spouse. And therefore, there is a punishment of up to 7 years. Now, it is not as if the man is absolved of the responsibility of maintaining his first wife and her children. He has to maintain them. But it's still because society regards it as such an egregious offense, and therefore it penalizes it. Now, what is therefore the difference between a civil wrong and a criminal offense? That's often the question. There may be an overlap. When you divorce your wife through something like triple talaq, there is a civil wrong too. But it can also be a penal offense, because a penal offense, there are many overlaps, like we have law of defamation, civil and criminal. Now, why is it that society makes certain acts a criminal offense as well? When a civil wrong will impact the individuals only, whereas a criminal offense is something where there is a societal concern, there is a larger issue, a public concern, public interest. And here, in my view, triple talaq is something so violative of the dignity of women. It affects a community at large. And therefore, it can certainly be said that there is a very strong public interest in protecting this, and therefore the penal offense. Now, interestingly, under 495 of the IPC, if you do not disclose to a person you marry that you are already married and that marriage is subsisting, there is a punishment of up to 10 years. So therefore, it is regarded as a complete fraud on marriage that you are entering into a second marriage without disclosing to that person that you are already married. So therefore, IPC, which has stood the test of time, has regarded things like this as very, very serious offenses and provided a stern punishment. Now, the other issue is that, is it something which is so contrary to the Sharia, penalizing or criminalizing issues like this? Now, one aspect is that, of course, the civil contract. It's a civil contract, and therefore the argument is you can't penalize it. Now, yes, of course, marriage is a civil contract under a Muslim law, unlike, say, Hindu law or Christian law, where it is a sacrament. But when the court has now de-recognized triple talaq as a method of divorce, that really means that now this is thrown outside the realm of marriage. This is no longer considered as a valid method of divorce. It is no longer within the realm of civil contract, and therefore there can be no bar on penalizing it. Now, apart from that, if we look at practices around us, you will find that even in Pakistan and Bangladesh, with whom we have a shared history, their 1961 code, in fact, petty, I would say, relatively petty procedural requirements, when they are violated, it can lead to imprisonment for 1 year. For example, you do not register your marriage, 1 year's imprisonment. You do not give prior notice to the arbitration council before seeking a divorce. 1 year's imprisonment. So there, in Egypt, for example, and I'm not suggesting that these are countries that we must emulate to any great level, but the point is that the Muslim world has moved forward. And we are lagging behind because, unfortunately, because Muslims are a minority and nobody wants to touch the issue. Now, one more thing I'd like to say here is that, you know, the argument has also been that, you know, Sharia, ultimately all this is God-given law. And therefore, there should be no earthly interference with it. We should not have reform. You cannot reread things or touch, as I said, something which is divinely ordained. Now, there too, there have been so many. IPC itself is a reform in India because the punishments are now one for whether you are Hindu or Muslim or anybody else. 2, the 39 Act that I mentioned, Dissolution of Marriage Act, that itself was regarded as a huge reform because when a Muslim woman wants a divorce which her husband is unwilling to give to her, she can go to a court and get a judicial decree from a secular court on certain grounds. And this was in 1939, well prior to independence. So that was a second. Third is, as we've seen, the rest of the world as well has moved forward, and therefore there is no bar on India moving forward. Now, for example, in Pakistan also, when they came in with their 1961 code, what is very interesting is that there was a schism between the traditionalists and the modernists, because the traditionalists said no, they took the doctrinaire approach. No, the Quran does not permit this, or the personal law, the Sharia does not permit this. But the modernists said that, look, what you must adopt is ijtihad, which is interpretive intelligence for a sort of modern, more flexible approach. Because what social justice may have demanded in the 7th century is not what social justice may demand. And the example that they gave was of polygamy. That in the 7th century, in a war-torn region where there were so many widows and orphans, they may have needed shelter, and therefore polygamy was encouraged for that purpose. Now, social justice, these are the examples given by the Commission report in Pakistan, that today, in today's times, this is a 1950s Pakistan report, and look where we are. So they said that, look, 7th century, you may not need to marry again at all. This is what social justice of today demands. So therefore, they adopted these principles of interpretive intelligence and came out with certainly a more reformative code than we have. 61, and we are in 2017. And I think I've covered more or less what I wanted to on the bill. But I think Ms. Soman is absolutely right. We need a much more comprehensive reform which covers issues like polygamy, nikah halala, maybe other issues also. But I think this is it's a baby step that has been taken with this judgment. I have personally realized how difficult it is to just change a status quo. So this is a baby step, but it is still a historic step. And I hope that, I think many more of us will realize that ultimately religion cannot be used as a pretext for denying gender justice. And that unfortunately the truth is that even secular feminists have been reluctant to comment on this issue only because it concerns a minority community. And I would therefore urge everyone to think of that minority within the minority. Thank you very much.